There you go. Okay. Welcome. Welcome, everybody, to St. Hilda's and the second Brain and Mind event of this year. You all have a program on your seat which can act as a memento of the event, but it also provides a little bit of further reading, especially for the students, and a little memento of the abstract and the title of the talk, and a little bio of the speakers. Now, many of you will be regulars at these events, but for those of you who are new, let me explain what we aim to do in these events. The point of these talks is to offer you the opportunity to experience different disciplinary perspectives on a particular topic. It will be news to some of you that, for example, philosophy has anything to say about a topic like addiction, a topic we covered a few years ago, or that neuroscience has anything to say about a topic like evil, another topic we've covered, or that psychology has anything to say about music and art, two topics that we've covered. Of course, for many of you, that's not very surprising, but it is surprising how narrow our focus can become once we embark on a course of study. One of the things we love about these events is the attendance by students from some of our local schools. Am I right in thinking there are a few students here tonight? Can you just kind of raise your hand so I can see? Go on, let me see. Excellent, this is really nice. Welcome. Welcome to St. Hilda's. Now, we hope that learning about how different disciplines study one and the same phenomenon, or a phenomenon that goes under the same name, can help you to decide on your future course of study. Let me now introduce the team that puts this together. I'm Dr. Anita Avramidis. I'm a senior research fellow in philosophy here at St. Hilda's. And along with Barnaby Burley here, that's Barnaby, who's sitting right there, a DPhil student in philosophy. And we look after the philosophy side of things. We have Anne Dowker. Anne is here, sitting in the front row. And she looks after the psychology side of things and is our psychology, she teaches psychology here at St. Hilda's. And we also have Professor Micah Glitch. If we could see you in Hamburg, you're not on the big screen. Micah, can you come on the big screen so I can see you? Oh, you can see her up there, okay. And she looks, there she is. There, now we can see you, Micah. She looks after the neuroscience side of things. Now, when I mentioned Professor Glitch in Hamburg, this reminds me to explain to those of you who are new that these events, at least since the pandemic, have been running in collaboration with the medical school in Hamburg. We're extremely pleased that we're able to support this European collaboration, and we're also pleased that largely we have the technology to support it. Now, tonight, the technology is a little bit iffy. As you can see, we've done this more smoothly in the past, but please bear with us with the technology. We're going to do our best. They're having a few glitches on that end as well. But we would like to thank the events team, Christina Hopkinson, for all their help, and Larissa Host in Hamburg. And while I'm extending thank yous, I'd like to thank St. Hilda's College for its continued financial support for this event. It's thanks to the college that you're able to enjoy a nice cup of coffee and tea before around 6 o'clock. We have a break for coffee and tea. But before we get to coffee and tea, we have some talks to hear. First, we're going to hear from the neuroscientist and from our psychologist. And after the break, after tea, we'll hear from philosophy. So there are going to be two breaks. After the first two talks, we're going to have a Q&A for about 15 minutes, then tea and coffee. Come back, do a philosophy talk, and then have about another half an hour for Q&A. So I hope we can get all your questions answered. So let's move on to tonight's event, decision-making / rationality and the brain. As much as possible, we try to select 3 topics to cover each year with an eye to some kind of overarching theme. This year, we began in Michaelmas term with the topic of belief, and we're following it this term with that of decision-making and rationality, which involves beliefs. And we're going to end in Trinity term with the topic of delusion, which we can think of as malfunctioning belief, or at least we can start thinking of it as malfunctioning belief. So ways of thinking about belief may be thought of a kind of overarching theme for the year. How do beliefs and decision-making fit together? Well, decision-making can be thought of very roughly as a way of bringing beliefs together in order to prepare us for action in the world. Of course, decision-making can be rational or it can be irrational. We mention rationality in our title because we were thinking in the first instance of the ideal, of decision-making in accordance with logical reasoning. But of course, human decision-making falls somewhat short of the ideal. Indeed, I believe we're going to hear a bit about that tonight from some of our speakers. So let me now introduce the first of our speakers. Our first speaker is from the medical school in Hamburg. It's Dr. Jan Broeke. He studied psychology at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where he also obtained his PhD after working for a couple of years at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston in the United States. Welcome, everybody. He is at present professor of medical psychology at the Medical School Hamburg, and he has an affiliation with the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. The title of his talk tonight is Functional Neuroanatomy of Irrational Decision-Making in OCD. Jan. Now, we're going to have our second speaker, the psychology, and Christina, come. Let's just make sure. What do I have to do anything, or is it just? No, we're going straight into the next speaker. So I'm going to introduce our second speaker in a moment, but I just want to be sure that the link works because he's going to be on Zoom tonight, I'm afraid. Nick?
There you go, he's on screen.
Hello, hello. I'm about to introduce you. I'm about to introduce the second speaker of the evening, Professor Nick Chater. Professor Chater is Professor of Behavioral Science at Warwick Business School, and he's the author and co-author of a great many papers and books, a Fellow of the British Academy, and a list of prizes, but I'm not going to tell you all about that. You can look him up. I'm delighted that he's able to join us this evening, albeit remotely, and we'll see him in a minute. The title of his talk is Bayesian Brains Without Probabilities. I'm going to say over to you, Nick. Can you do the magic?
Thank you very
there
much.
You go.
I have to be given permission to share my screen, I think.
Oh, do you?
I think at the moment it's telling me I can't. Oh, no, maybe I can.
No, you're there.
I'm there. Okay, that's good.
Can I just check? Can you see in Hamburg, please?
Yeah.
Yep, okay. It looks like we're okay, Nick.
Right, that's great. Hang on. I'm just struggling to actually see anything myself now. Hang on. We're nearly there.
And just speak up a little bit, okay? Can you hear him?
No, I'm just getting some slight problem with screen sharing. I don't quite know what that is.
You're sharing in Hamburg.
So I'm showing. Is everything showing okay?
Yep, you're sharing in Hamburg for sure.
That's good. Now, what I can't actually see, this is ironic, I can't actually see my own screen for some baffling reason. Oh dear. What's going on here? So I can see everybody except myself. So I can't see my own, I can see my own face, but I can't see the screen. I've never seen this before. Do I want to try again now? Okay, yes, let me try that again. It says I'm screen sharing. Oh, and I'm getting a screen which is absolutely tiny, but that's a good start. So is that working?
We can see it?
You can see it? I can only see it, bizarrely, in a thumbnail size. I think this is some sort of novelty. I've never seen this from Zoom before, but I think we'll get there in a second. Hang on. What is going on? I've got a little green box around it, and it's really, really teeny. Let me see if I can actually advance my slides. No. Oh, I'm so sorry about this. I don't know what's going on. Let me try. I'll stop sharing and restart. Perhaps I'll even rejoin Zoom, actually. Let me just try that. Let me just try. I'll stop sharing, restart sharing, and then maybe we'll do something more drastic.
Okay. Okay. Hang on.
Okay.
Three different technologies. We've got the Hamburg, we've got Nick's technology, we've got our technology, and a glitch at either end. And we get problems, but
It's
hang
just
on.
settings on Nick's side.
Yeah.
No, that's not working.
Doesn't he need to kind of make the...
Yeah, he needs to pop that in presentation
You
mode.
just need to put it into presentation mode, Nick.
Okay, that's true. Yes, I will do that.
Little bit I know.
I have a feeling that won't solve the problem. I still can't see my own screen. Hang on, let's do it though. We'll be there. I'm sure it'll be fine doing it. Well, this might be better. Something. Can you?
It's disappeared
If
from.
I'm putting it into presentation mode now, but can you see it?
No. Now we don't see it.
Okay, right. Let's have another go at the sharing. I should stop sharing. Oh, hang on. Let's try again.
This is a new problem in academia. We used to have paper.
Well, there used to be lots of problems, but not this one. Can you see it now? No? Oh dear.
Let's see.
What is going on here? Perhaps I'll just rejoin Zoom. Sorry about this. I'll just try again. Hang on. Yes.
Nick, if you're going to read, could you just speak up a little bit? Because you're audible, but it would be nice to have it a little bit.
Was that me?
There you go. That's a little bit better.
Sorry, I got a comment asking me to do something or suggesting that I might do something. Possibly of a technical nature. Nope.
We could just watch you while you talk to us. That would be nice. I think that would work.
Shall I just not have slides? Is that going to be okay?
Yeah, do it without the slides. Go on.
Yes, we can do it without the slides.
Yeah,
okay, let's do that. We don't need slides. I apologise for all that. I don't know. I've been on Zooms and Teams all day, and suddenly it's all gone wrong. So you can hear me okay then?
No. You've done something. Speak it up a bit. Don't go. You faded a little bit. Stay nice and loud.
Is that better?
Okay. Are we okay with that?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I'll try and speak really loudly. So to say something about the viewpoint from psychology. So what psychologists are usually interested in is understanding the mechanisms underpinning behavior, but they normally focus primarily on thinking about the kinds of information processing we're doing. So rather than thinking directly, although it's super important and relevant, about the actual mechanisms in the brain that are operative, they're usually thinking primarily about what kind of calculations the brain is making, what's it figuring out. So you're thinking of the brain as a kind of amazingly powerful biological computer. And the question is, how does it work? And in this case, of course, how does it make decisions? Now, what I want to talk about today is not quite getting as far as decisions. As Anita mentioned, a critical thing to have as your starting point for making decisions is to have beliefs about the world, to have a model of reality. But I want to say a little bit about how we build that model of reality, only in a very crude way, but to draw out something of that for decision making. So here's a really simple caricature of how we might think about what the brain is doing. The world's a very complicated and uncertain place, and we've somehow got to build very local and specific and rather crude models of how the world works. So, for example, you might have a model of the sound patterns in your language. So in a particular language, German or English, Chinese, whatever it is, the patterns, the types of sound that occur differ from one language to another, and also the sequences in which they occur differ from one language to another. And so to be able to use the language fluently and understand it, you want to be able to build some kind of statistical or other model of how the language is functioning. And you might then say, well, maybe more than that, we actually have a grammar too, to put all the words together into logical orders and so on. And we might have rules about want to try to model the different speakers of the language. So we might want to have a different understanding of what to expect in terms of speech sounds from different people. So males and females, people with different accents, and also specific individuals. So, for example, if I hear a particular person I know speaking, I immediately know it's them. And according to this model-based view, the idea is that I have some kind of local model of the world, which includes the model of the specifics of that speaker. And I put that together with my little model of the language and the sounds in the language, and that allows me to explain, by putting these models together, how to generate what they're saying. So the trick here, the trick we're assuming that the brain is using, is it's trying a kind of process which has long been talked about in psychology for at least, I suppose, 60 years, of what's called analysis by synthesis. You're thinking to yourself, here's some information coming into my brain, maybe through the eyes or ears, and the question is, what could have created it? How could it have come to be? So what I'm trying to do is to build a model out of little components, which will allow me to explain where that information comes from. So I'll have a model of what the language contains, the words and the speech sounds. I'll have a model of the specific speaker. I'll also have details of where they are in the room, and also is it an echoey room, and so on and so on. And all of these things, which we're assuming are separately modeled, can together provide me an explanation for the data I'm getting, the actual sounds that are coming into my ears, or the things that I'm seeing. So this analysis by synthesis approach is quite a strange one when you think about it, because what your objective is when you perceive the world is your objective is to interpret, to provide a high-level abstract interpretation of the sensory information that's coming into your eyes. So the mapping is going from sensory information in the senses to abstract description. But you're doing it, according to this analysis by synthesis perspective, you're doing it by going in the other direction. You're saying, I know I've got a really good and good analysis, because it recreates, it synthesizes by my clever internal model application of these models, it recreates the thing I'm seeing. So it's a bit like trying to work out what something is by reconstructing it. Now, and this may sound like a rather sort of arcane and strange perspective, but oddly enough, it's in fact the dominant perspective, really, in psychology of perception and motor control, and to some extent decision making. And often it's known as the Bayesian approach. So the idea of the Bayesian approach is you try to model this model building perspective using the rules, among other things, of probability theory. So for people who've heard of the Bayesian approach, some of you may indeed work in it. To me, at least, the Bayesian approach is really just saying probability theory is part of the story, which of course it is, because the world is a very uncertain place. So any model of any complicated aspect of the world is going to have to take account of uncertainty. So that's your sort of starting point. We've got this idea that the brain is this amazing, or maybe seems to be, this amazing machine for resynthesizing data that we experience. And I just want to give you one or two reasons why you might believe that, just in case you're thinking, well, that sounds extremely unlikely. There are lots of reasons, but one simple one is the existence of imagery. So the fact that I can imagine things when they're not there, I can think, what does a duck look like? Or imagine a kangaroo jumping over a house. I can't imagine it very well, but the fact that I can imagine it at all is a clue that I am able to map from the abstract description all the way down to the, as it were, the sensory, not necessarily at a very detailed level. So that's telling me there's some kind of relationship that my brain is computing from the abstract to the sensory input, as well as in the other direction. So that's one thing. But the other thing, of course, is that, well, there are so many, but if you cover up different bits of the image or you obliterate bits of sound, your brain will fill them in. And the way it fills them in is in a way that makes perfect sense if you imagine it's building this abstract description. So if I see a person going behind a tree, if I've interpreted them as a person who I can't see because they're behind a tree, I've got a full person represented in my mind. I don't think they're missing various bits of leg and arm and so on. I think they're a full person. And so I interpret them as a fully fledged object, just obscured by a tree, rather than thinking of them as two half persons with a gap in the middle. And that tendency to fill in is extremely natural and easy for us. And it makes sense, very easy to understand from this sort of analysis by synthesis perspective. And there are many, many other arguments which I won't go into, including the fact that there's a lot of reciprocal connections in the perceptual system, just at a neural level. So instead of the perceptual signal just going in one direction from the senses to the cortex, it goes. All the machinery goes in the other direction too. Okay, that's all very well, but a practical question for the brain is how can it actually work with these models in practice? If we had all these models of the world, they're going to be really complicated to do calculations with and really complicated to use to make decisions. So, for example, you might think that your best bet, in fact, this is what you would think if you're a perfectly rational economic agent, if you saw some ambiguous situation in the world, you should think, well, given that ambiguous information, what are the various things that could be true and how likely are they? So, for example, if you see a car speeding towards you, you don't quite know how fast it's going. So what you should do is calculate all the possible speeds it might be going and possibly all the trajectories it might be going in. And then you should think, well, in that case, looking at all those possibilities, should I cross the road or not? So I should look at all the various possible interpretations, look at my action in light of all those interpretations. So I should be able to decide to cross or not cross based on all of these different possibilities. And the claim that I want to put to you the really extreme perspective, I think it's a bit too extreme, but the really extreme perspective would say that the brain doesn't actually look at all those possibilities. It more or less looks at one. That's the extreme point. But let's just say. So instead of, when the brain's working out an interpretation of reality, it doesn't think, oh, well, this interpretation's got a chance of 0.2, and this one's got a chance of 0.3, and this one's got a chance of 0.11. In fact, there would be thousands. It just says, well, it could be like this. And if it's like this, then this is what I'm going to do. So a really simple principle of decision making is, and it's not necessarily a good one always, is to say, given the data you've got, think of what this could mean, what it could explain this using your analysis by synthesis strategy. In fact, there are many things that could explain it, but just think of one, the first one that comes to your mind. Imagine that's true and choose your action on that basis. So going back to the car, if I can't really tell how quickly the car's going, but I just make a stab. I think, well, it could be going at this speed, in which case it's safe, so I'm going to cross. Now, as long as there isn't too much uncertainty, you're probably okay. But what I'm suggesting is that your brain is not very good at drawing multiple samples, and certainly not very good at looking at all possibilities. It's just looking at one at a time. Now, here's one or two observations. If I had slides, I'd give you lots of exciting-looking experiments, but they wouldn't be any more informative. So you're not missing anything important here. But let me just give you one or two hints about why one might think we're using this one-shot approach. Now, the first one is that it's just much quicker. So, for example, if I'm wondering what somebody's going to say next, then my best bet is quite easy to think, well, they might say this. So if I can easily continue your sentence. If you say something and I think, I bet you're going to say this. If I want to compute all the things you might say and all the things I might say back, I mean, that's getting very complicated. So if I just think of one, so I think, you're going to insult me horribly, and then I might react and be cross even before you've said it. But I haven't actually sampled all the possible things you might say. You might be joking. You might not be joking. But the brain is just jumping one way. Now, one reason we tend to believe this is the case is that when you think about how perception works, we only ever see one interpretation or perceive one interpretation of the world at a time. So if I play you an ambiguous word, for example, a word that is halfway between or somehow or has two meanings, actually. Normally, you hear one of those meanings, not the other. But or if I play you a word which is carefully adjusted to be halfway between two words, so it's a bit like I don't know, it's in between I don't know, good and I don't know. Can't think about a nice ambiguous word here, but a word where you're just changing one sound, which makes it hard to tell if it's one word or another. Then usually you hear it one way or another way. You don't hear both. You don't hear a mix. And similarly with all these famous ambiguous stimuli like the Necker cube, you see the Necker cube as pointing one way or the other way, but you can't see it as both. And so this fits with this sampling idea. The brain is trying to reinterpret, trying to reconstruct the world in front of it, but it's only doing it one sample at a time. So it's going into the space of all possible hypotheses, but instead of cleverly saying, oh, there's thousands of hypotheses, all with different probabilities, it just says, I'm choosing one, and that's the only one I'm aware of. Give it a bit more time, it might choose another one. But over a short time period, it'll basically just choose one. And then you'll make a decision based on that. You'll just assume, well, that's the only thing I can see. That's the only interpretation I have. I'm going to assume it's true, and I'm going to make my decision. So let me finish with one very famous piece of data. And I'm not completely sure of my explanation for this data. And it's not just mine. Many people have given this explanation based on this kind of story. For example, Ed Vull at University of California at San Diego, and many others. Tom Griffiths at Princeton as well, and Sam Gershman at Harvard, and many other people around the world have said similar things. So I'm just going to say the same thing. I'm not completely sure it's right, but at least it's an interesting hypothesis. So let's consider this famous phenomenon called the matching law. Now, in the matching law, you have an uncertain sequence. So, for example, suppose it's a coin, and it's a biased coin. So say it comes up heads 3/4 of the time, and tails 1/4 of the time. And your job is to predict what it's going to do next. And you get a euro every time you get it right. And if you get it wrong, you get nothing. So you're very well incentivized. And what do? Well, what you should do, of course, is you should spot pretty quickly. Well, it seems to do a lot of heads, this coin. It's a pretty weird coin, lots of heads. I will just guess every time heads. And that's a good idea, because that way you're going to get 3/4 of the time, you'll get your euro. But what people actually do is they guess heads 3/4 of the time, and they guess tails 1/4 of the time. They don't always do this, but this is the predominant thing. So that's weird. So they match in their responses the probabilities in the world. Now, that's a really stupid thing to do if people were able to entertain both possibilities. If they're able to think, what's going to happen next? Two possibilities, heads or tails. Heads is more likely. Therefore, I should guess heads, because that's going to give me the best expected value return. But if people are only able to think of a single interpretation, so they're essentially drawing one simulation of reality and thinking, what's going to happen next? Well, 3/4 of the time, the thing that's going to happen next is going to be heads. Because if I built a little model of how this coin works, 3/4 of the time, it's going to say heads. 1/4 of the time, it's going to say tails. So if I take this, as it were, very stupid one-shot approach, one sample approach, then on 3/4 of the time, I think, I think it's going to be heads. Okay, I'm guessing heads. And then the other 1/4 of the time, I think this time, I think it's going to be tails. And I guess tails. Now that's silly. I should always say heads, 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 heads forever. But that's not, doesn't seem to be what we do. So lots more elaborate experiments which at least push in that direction. But that's the simplest of them all. But what it's telling you is that sometimes, though I think in general the brain is doing something quite sensible when it's choosing one or a small number of samples to represent the entire space of probabilities, sometimes it can lead us to do very silly things indeed, as in the probability matching. But then again, the reason we're doing silly things is probably because that sort of situation doesn't come up that often. Most of the time, we're dealing with a very complicated world, where you couldn't possibly keep track of all the probabilities of all the possible options, all the possible ways the world could be. That's just way too hard. So normally, to make the cognition possible at all, to make the problem of representing the world tractable at all, you just have to choose one or a few possible samples. You can't represent all the options. When you make the problem really simple, then actually you really could choose two options, multiple samples, and you'd do a lot better if you did. But we can't really do that. So the thought here is that the brain is building models of the world. It builds builds one sample of one model at a time. And it tends to make decisions based on the assumption that the sample it's happened to draw, even though that's one of many possibilities often, that particular sample is the true one. So I'll stop there. Apologies for the lack of slides, but probably didn't hurt.
Thank you, Nick. That was really interesting. Good. Stay with us, okay? Because we're going to have a Q&A now, and we can have questions both from Hamburg. So can we have the screen for Hamburg? And then you can also see Hamburg. And we've got the audience here. Now, I was going to... Yes, you can already see the audience here, I think. Yeah, there we go. So, raise your hands for questions on those two. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a quick question to Jan. Basically, how specific are the...
Sorry, can you please give the microphone? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. My very specific question to Jan is, how specific are the changes in decision processes caused by deep brain stimulation in relation to OCD? Presumably, stimulating the sensitive part of the brain, a crucial part of the brain, causes many decisions to change, not only the ones which are OCD symptoms. And because you showed us the decline in symptoms, we haven't got a base to compare it against. So can you expand on that a bit?
Let me see if there's a question in Hamburg. Micah? We're not hearing you. We're not hearing you. Okay, while we're waiting for them to sort that out, we've got a question over here. Could you pass the mic? You can come in a minute, Micah, when you've got your...
Can you hear me?
Yep,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Another question for Jan. So I guess the way we talk about decision-making and rationality I come from an addiction background. We often say irrational behaviors or maladaptive drug use, things like this. And recently I've thought a lot about how the framing of this is important, perhaps. So in the case of OCD, maybe if we think about it egocentrically, for the patient, these behaviors are rational because it decreases anxiety and stress. Maybe for someone using drugs, it keeps them from, wanting to commit suicide, something like this. And do you think it's important that we, if we were to change the framing of the question that way, would that change the kind of outcome, I guess the way you would interpret neural data, the way you would design experiments? Do you think that perhaps if we said, okay, actually what the patient's behavior is rational behavior, the circuits are working how they should given the circumstances, we have all these other inputs to the decision-making circuitry that are somehow shifting its function. Do you think that would, I don't know, perhaps change how we move forward or think about the problem differently? Or do you think it wouldn't?
Micah, do you have a question in Hamburg?
We do. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can now.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. I've got a question for Jan. You talked about the task reversal difficulty as a classical feature of OCD. In a way, addiction is a difficulty to reverse a task. And you've already mentioned the nucleus accumbens, which obviously dopamine release there is also a cause for addictive behaviors. I was wondering, addictions can be treated in part by removing the person from the environment that they're used to. Is it possible to put the same task in a different setting and then people can reverse and unlearn previous behaviors? Is that something that's possible? Okay, I was wondering, you said quite rightly that the brain seems to choose one possible scenario and then act on that assumption. Isn't that A, protective? So you would tend to be conservative in what you choose to assume to save your life, and B, experience? And doesn't that also explain why people will say, I'm not always going to guess heads because there has got to be tails sometimes. It cannot always be heads.
Yes, I think there are lots of reasons why just saying heads all the time feels like a ridiculous thing to do. I mean, one of which, of course, is that you want to produce a set of predictions that look a bit like the data you saw before. So you've seen a mix of heads and tails, and if somebody says, well, predict the next 20 coins, then if you just say, well, heads, 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 you think, well, that's just weird.
Sorry, Micah, do you want to follow that up?
Which is as close as possible, a single sample, but as close as possible to the world you've encountered before. Now, I think this question of the choice of sample is a very interesting one. So we, in our group, have generally assumed, and this may well be not quite right, we've generally assumed that people are sampling in a way that's pretty utility-free. They're not thinking, if I'm going to choose a sample, I should choose a sample which isn't going to lead me to just do something crazy. So, for example, going back to my car, it seems like if I'm going to choose a wild stab about how quickly it's going, I better choose a stab in which I think it's going to go quicker than in reality, but not slower. If I think, oh, well, you never know, it might just really slow down fast, I'll walk out in front of it. That would be a really dangerous thing to do. Now, whether we can detect that in experiments, I don't know, actually. It's a really interesting question. The normal assumption is that these questions of utility only come up rather late, and the sampling process is just very, very basic, and you can't really change it. And I wonder if that's wrong, actually. So, yeah, very interesting question.
I think we have a question here. We actually have two. Let's start with the one behind, and then if we have time, we'll have one more. We started a bit late with Nick because of the technical difficulties, so I'll just take 5 minutes from our tea.
Thanks. I have a question for Nick as well. My question is, what exactly in your research do you mean by our brains use a Bayesian framework? Given that I think in many respects of everyday life, our brains are actually not using kind of a Bayesian approach. For example, we often mix up the chances of getting a positive COVID test, given that we're positive, or given that we are infected, with the probability or the chances that we are positive, given that we have a positive test. So I think sometimes this can be very tricky for our brains to distinguish. So exactly what kind of is the definition in your research of the Bayesian approach?
Yes, no, that's a super good question. So I think we are absolutely hopeless at doing probability calculations, and very bad at making estimates of verbal, the probability of verbally stated events too. So if you say things like, if you have a positive COVID test, how likely are you to have COVID? Then the fact that I should know, the base rates are absolutely crucial to that, how much COVID is around, but I don't even notice that. So yes, I mean, you're quite completely right, and there's lots of very interesting work on that. So our assumption, and I think this is the standard assumption in sort of Bayesian cognitive science and Bayesian neuroscience, is that the brain isn't able to do any of this stuff explicitly or verbally or mathematically at all. The models are completely implicit. They're more like what's inside a deep neural network than they are than something that's sort of verbally stated mathematical calculation. And because of that, you've got no access to those models at all. So absolutely none. All you can do, and this goes back to the sampling point, all you can do is prod them and get samples out of them. So if you think about language as a good example, a very intuitive example, so I presumably have some kind of model of the language I'm using, because here I am using it. But if you say to me, given these words, what's the probability of various continuations? I haven't got a clue. And probably I'd make all kinds of ludicrous probability mistakes if I tried to say. For example, the probabilities of the continuations wouldn't add up to 1, which they jolly well ought to. But on the other hand, I can sample. So if I say the cat sat on the mat, what happens next? I say, well, the cat sat on the mat and then was leapt on by a dog or went out of the door or whatever it is. And I can do this indefinitely. I can produce loads of samples, but I can't tell you what the probability of any of those samples is. All I can do is do the sampling. So the thing is here that if you want to solve really complex computational probability problems, as people do in machine learning and computational statistics, you have to do it by some approximate method. And the one that's most popular, I should have probably mentioned this, is sampling. So often it's really easy to draw samples from a distribution, even if you've no idea what the probability distribution actually is. So I think your point is a crucial one, actually. The sense in which we're Bayesians is purely a sense in which the deep machinery of our brains is able to build these models of the world and sample from them. But if you ask me a probability question, I haven't got a clue how to solve it, and will make all kinds of ridiculous errors. So I'm sort of at an explicit verbal level, not Bayesian at all, but possibly, and these most people, or many people in this kind of world tend to assume, at least, that if you looked at our perceptual system or our language system, that's quite a Bayesian thing. Now that's the claim. So yeah, very good point.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop us here. We've got a question from Anne, but Anne, you're the first one at the next Q&A, okay? And that's for you, Nick. So we'll see you at 6:30. So can you come back on both in Hamburg and Nick, and we'll see everybody at 6:30. Go out, right. Grab a cup of tea. Don't be shy. Just go up and take it quickly so that we can get back in here quickly, okay? So don't hang around. because we've got a lot of people to get through. Welcome back, everybody. Now, a bit of philosophy. Our final speaker is Professor Richard Pettigrew. He is Professor of Philosophy in the Philosophy Department at the University of Bristol. His research is on the philosophy of mathematics, the foundations of rational reasoning under uncertainty, and the theory of rational decision-making. So, right on target. So, Richard, welcome.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Anita, and thanks very much to everyone for coming and for the invitation to speak at this. So, as Anita says, this is the philosophy section of the evening. And maybe one thing to say to introduce that is to say a bit about how it's going to differ from what's gone before. Let me put so I know what time I'm at. So both of the previous talks have had some distinctive features. One of them is that they've been mainly descriptive in the sense we're kind of looking at ways in which human brains in fact think about the world and in fact approach the world, make their decisions and so on. There was reference, of course, to words like normativity, words like rationality, which are normative words that tell you kind of how things should be as opposed to just how things are. But the particular studies that Jan and Nick were both talking about were ones that described how people in fact make decisions. I'm going to be talking instead on what philosophers tend to call the normative side or the prescriptive side, how we should do things, what are the rational ways. So where psychologists and neuroscientists might be interested in how we in fact deviate from the things that we should do when we're reasoning, philosophers are often interested in figuring out what are the kind of rational ways. And we had a question earlier about whether this is in fact the kind of most helpful way to talk about some of these apparent pathologies like OCD and so on, whether we really should be using the terminology of rationality or something like that. But if that sort of terminology isn't the sort of thing you're particularly comfortable with, the thing I'm really talking about is kind of how would we want to reason best? What's the kind of best way for us to think about the world and think about the decisions that we make that would kind of lead us best to our goals? We have particular goals, things that we want in our lives and from the world, and we have certain beliefs about the way that the world is, and we want to put those things together in order to try to get the things that we want as well as we can. And so one way you might understand what rational decision-making is, the sort of things philosophers are interested in, and psychologists and neuroscientists are sort of measuring deviation from, or the extent to which we in fact conform to it. Think of that as kind of thinking about what the best ways are to get those goals. Another slight difference between this talk and previous talks is they've focused quite a lot on the belief side of decision-making. But there are two sides to decision-making, as I just kind of alluded to in what I just said. In decision-making, we have particular goals, ends, things that we want, desires, values, something like that. And so there's this things that we're trying to get. But of course, how we get them, the best means to get them, will be determined by how the world is. If I want a sandwich and I'm trying to make a decision how to get it, then I need to know where there is a sandwich for me to get. So my beliefs about the world, my uncertainties about the world are crucial, but also the things that I actually want are going to be important. And I'm going to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent, focus a little bit on the values side of decision-making. If you think of what a good decision-making theory is a way of bringing together the values we have, the things we want, the desires we have, how we'd like the world to be, with our beliefs about how the world in fact is and so on, to figure out the best ways of getting those things we value. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the values side. Good. Okay, so that was just sort of trying to situate this talk with relation to the other talks. So I'm going to talk about a puzzle for rational belief. Now, there are certain ways in which the theory of how you should make decisions rationally is reasonably well sort of worked out and understood, at least in its core elements. So there's a particular area of sort of economics, philosophy, intersection between economics, philosophy, psychology, and so on, called decision theory, where people try to work out a kind of ideal theory of how you would make decisions were you kind of a perfect reasoner who could kind of work out everything perfectly. And it takes in your uncertainty about the world and what you value about the world, and it tells you how you should make decisions when you're faced with them. And as I say, it's reasonably well worked out, and economists use this sometimes to kind of predict how ideal societies would evolve or make decisions, or how people will decide what commodities to buy and so on. But there are also bits of it where it's very much not determined. There's kind of maybe cases at the edge, but as we might see, they're not just peripheral cases. They're not just pathological cases, but cases at the edge where it might just be a lot less clear what you should do. And that's really what I'm going to talk about today, is a particular sort of case, particular sort of decision that we face. And they might be quite common in your life, but really they're often quite large-scale decisions that you make in your life, like the career that you have, whether or not to become a parent, whether to move to a different country, whether to join a war, these sort of large-scale decisions. And I'm going to talk about how the standard way we think about making decisions can break down in those cases, and how we might rectify. Okay, so this is not a problem that is that I've dreamt up. In some form, it's sort of been circulating around in the economics literature for some years. But in philosophy, it was sort of largely introduced by these three individuals on the screen at the moment. So top right, Edna Ullmann-Margalit, and bottom right is Christer Bikvist, who wrote in about 2006 about the sort of problem that I'm going to raise. But in some ways, it sort of didn't gain an awful lot of traction until a book about 6 or 7 years ago by Laurie Paul, who's the person on the left-hand side, a book called Transformative Experience, which we have here, where it really kind of grasped the mainstream and sort of, ended up getting, op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and sort of ended up getting a lot of kind of media attention. Okay. So that's sort of how it entered into philosophy. So let me talk you through the problem to begin with, or at least the problem in the way that I describe it, although I think of it. Maybe I'll just say it in abstract first, and then I'll go into this particular case of an area that I want to talk about. So as I said, in our theory of rational decision-making, we're kind of bringing two bits of our way of thinking about the world together in order to make decisions. On the one hand, there's our beliefs. They represent our uncertainty about the world. And, say, using the sort of model that Nick was talking about, they might be represented by probabilities. So just take a really mundane decision, like whether to take an umbrella or not when you leave the house. What goes into that decision? What determines what would be the right decision for you to make in that situation? Well, on the one hand, it's going to be determined by how much you like and dislike certain scenarios. So how much do you like getting wet or dislike getting wet? How much do you really dislike carrying around an umbrella if it's unnecessary? So that side matters, like how much do you like different ways the world might be. But on the other side, what also matters is how likely you think different situations are. So, if I have very good reason, I live in Bristol, so I often do have very good reason to think that it's going to rain, and I grew up in Edinburgh, so I grew up having very good reason to think it was going to rain when I left the house. If I have good reason to think that it's going to rain, then that's going to make it, more likely that I should take the umbrella. If I really hate getting wet, that's going to make it more likely that the thing is that I should take the umbrella. But if I also really, really hate carrying around some superfluous object that I don't need, then maybe that's going to weigh in the other side. But the important thing is there's these two kind of sets of things that go into determining what the right sort of action is for us to take. What we think, the way that we think the world is, and what we value. And standard decision theory just says, look, here's a way of weighing these things up against each other. In fact, Nick alluded to it in right towards the end of his talk. He talked about expected utility or expected value of doing something. And this is just a way of combining how much you value things with how likely you think things are in order to kind of come up with a particular number, and then you can compare them for each of the different options you could choose. But there's an assumption in all of this standard way of thinking about decision-making that's standardly used in economics and so on. And that is that the values that you have, how much you like different ways the world could be, is pretty much constant across the course of your life. Or maybe if it doesn't think that, it's at least constant between the time you make the decision and some later time when the effect of the decision comes about. You don't think that beforehand you're going to really love having, really hate getting wet, but when you go outside and get wet, you're suddenly going to come to love it. That's typically not how people think about that sort of decision. You think, oh, look, we've got this constant kind of way we value the world, and it's that you put into your expected utility calculation to figure out how to do it. But we all know, I imagine, that this is not always true. Your values do sometimes change. And sometimes they might even change between when you make the decision and when the effects of the decision are being felt. And that might be particularly true of large-scale life decisions, because those large-scale life decisions usually play out their effects across a much longer period of time. So if I choose to move to another country, typically the effects of that will play out for a long time. If I'm choosing a particular career to take on, of course you don't have to do it for the rest of your life, but you'll probably do it for a number of years. And so these decisions play out over quite a long time, and it could easily be that how much you value things changes over the course of those decisions. And, interestingly, they can sometimes even change because of the decision you made. And this is the sort of thing that Laurie Paul talks about as being a transformative experience. So you make a particular decision, but after making that decision, and because of the experiences you have as a result of it, your values change. How much you value different things changes. Okay, so you might be wondering what on earth these symbols are on this screen, so let me talk you through them now. So this is a particular example inspired by a paper by a psychologist called Anat Bardi. So we imagine a character in our example called Aneri. Now she's making a decision. She's got to choose whether she's choosing what career to pick. And this is all going to be terribly simplified because one doesn't just immediately decide the career and then immediately succeed in getting onto and all that sort of thing. But let's just imagine all doors open to Aneri, okay, whichever she chooses. She's got to choose between becoming a police officer or becoming a conservation officer for her local authority or local community. Now, at the moment, she'd much, much prefer being a conservation officer. So I'm just going to use numbers to represent how much she values these things. Don't put too much weight on those. In some ways, we've got to think with these numbers in order to do the standard way calculations that economists think we should do. But, as I said, don't put too much weight on them. The point is that the leaf represents the conservation, the badge represents the police, if that wasn't obvious. So she's standing here at the question mark point, trying to make the decision, and she thinks, I would much more value a life in which I'm a conservation officer. At the moment, for instance, let's suppose she's someone who, she's not entirely a renegade, but she likes setting her own agenda to some extent. And she knows, of course, if she's a conservation officer, she is going to have to abide by certain rules and take orders from various people. But she's going to have a lot of room to kind of make her own mark on the job as well. And that's something she really values at the moment. Okay. Whereas being a police officer, she's really going to have to follow some pretty rigid rules, and at the moment that's not something that she values. But she's read some psychological research. It's not entirely definitive on this point, but you might think that if she were to choose to be a conservation officer, let's take the bottom branch there, choose to be a conservation officer, basically her values won't change at all. She'll continue to value that more than the life where she was a police officer, alternative life where she was a police officer. But, and this is the crucial part, if she were to become a police officer, she would gradually, her values will what the psychologists call socialize to the career that she's chosen. In particular, maybe she comes to value a more conforming way of life than the more kind of renegade way or the more kind of self-authoring way of life. She values that sort of fitting within a structure where there's certain rules and so on. And she does this exactly because she became a police officer. Okay. So now we have this strange situation where, at the moment, she gives much greater value to being a conservation officer. But she also knows that were she to choose to be a police officer, she would come to value that outcome much more. And in fact, a great deal more. So she gives 10 to being a police officer were she to choose to be a police officer. and only 4 to being a conservation officer. Whereas if she chooses to be a conservation officer, she values the degree 6 being that, and 2 to being a police officer. So one puzzle for decision theories, which are these kind of often mathematically stated, but the mathematics of them don't matter an enormous amount for our purposes here, but they're sort of approaches to decision making. One problem for the standard ways is that they don't have any mechanism for dealing with that sort of thing, or at least as they're usually presented, they don't have a mechanism for dealing with cases where your values, or as they call them, utilities, change from one time to the next. Okay, I'm not going to talk about Blondin. So here's one way, one sort of solution that you might put forward. And Edna Ullmann Margalit, the person who kind of was one of the first philosophers to introduce the problem, sort of mentions or discusses this sort of solution, but I don't think it's quite going to work. So her thought is something like, look, people don't just have values about the way the world is going to work out, or the way their life is going to work out. They also have values about what sort of person they would like to be and what sort of values they would like to have themselves. So perhaps as well as kind of wanting to be a conservation officer, Aneri also wants to be a conservation officer. So I'm sure we've all had these sorts of experiences where we have particular kind of desires or values or things, but we'd quite like to be the sort of person that values something else. I quite often get this with literature. I'd love to be someone who had kind of much more highbrow tastes in literature, but I don't. So quite often we have particular values. We like certain things to certain amounts, but we'd quite like to be some different sort of person. So one solution you might think to this is, look, Aneri should just decide what sort of person do I want to be. I should just choose whatever is going to lead me to be that sort of person. I currently, value the life of a conservation officer. Let's just look at that again. So value the life of a conservation officer. But do I want to be someone who values the life of a conservation officer, or do I actually want to be the sort of person who values being a police officer? Answer that question, and that gives you the answer to the problem. But there's a problem with that solution. The problem is that those values, which sometimes get called higher order values or higher order utilities, they're sort of, values about what you want to value, or values about values, they will change often just in the same way that your first order values. So it could well be that, when she starts off, she wants to be a conservation officer more than a police officer, and indeed wants to want that more than wants to want the other thing. But were she to become a police officer, not only would she value the life of kind of greater conformity that it affords her, but she'd also want to be that sort of person that she's now become. Because most of the time, in fact, we do have these cases like me with the highbrow literature, but most of the time we actually like being or value being the sort of people who have the other values, the values that we in fact have. So this doesn't seem to solve the problem, it just seems to put it back a step. Our problem was originally, you've got yourself now and yourself in the future, and they may have different values. How do you solve this? It's not much use to tell you, well, just look to your higher order values, because they might change in lockstep. So I want to just propose to you an alternative sort of solution, and sort of point out how it and some of the issues that it raises, because I think it ends up making quite an interesting suggestion. And it's a good place to do it, because in some ways it's inspired by the kind of ethical thinking of a philosopher called Derek Parfit, who was based in Oxford until he died. Okay, so the idea here is you think of yourself not as a single person who lasts from your birth to your death, but as made up as a series of different selves. People who kind of, so there was myself maybe between age, who knows, babies have all sorts of strange things going on. But so maybe there's lots and lots of different selves there. So they're changing so quickly and their brain's so plastic and so on, But then later on, maybe, things settle a little bit. Maybe between 12 and 15, I was a kind of particular self. But then, things changed quite a lot during my teenage years. 15 to 18, I was a different self, and so on. You kind of, you can imagine that I'm made up of different selves who have different values. I did have different values back when I was younger. So think of yourself now as a collection of people, not as a single person who endures throughout your entire lifetime. And then think what's really going on is I'm trying to make a decision on behalf of that group of people. But that's the sort of thing that we have some theories for dealing with. This is what democratic theory is kind of all about, or voting theory in philosophy or in political science is all about this. How do groups make decisions based on the fact that they may well have divergent values? So this is why we vote for, maybe a representative democracy or something like that. You're taking the kind of wild variety of values that are represented throughout the whole of a particular country's population and trying to come up with a single decision. And that's what's going on also in this case, I think. But one interesting feature of this, I'll just say to wrap up, is that it now makes decisions sit in a rather strange place between what you might think of as morality and what's sometimes called prudential rationality. So the distinction between this is usually put as follows. Morality is about kind of other regarding considerations. So when I make a decision and you say there are moral considerations, you mean, oh, your decision will affect other people, and because of certain duties that we have or obligations that we have to other people, there are kind of moral considerations. Prudential ones are ones where it really only just affects myself. So that decision where it just affects myself, there doesn't seem to be any moral aspect. But if we now start to think of ourselves as this kind of entity, this kind of thing, this person structured out of lots of different people, could there be moral considerations between them, these different individuals? So a couple of examples. Suppose one of your past selves made some great sacrifice. Ended up not doing what they wanted. Maybe you're like a high school pupil and they've given up all the kind of fun they could have had during their teenage years to kind of study really, really hard in order to kind of get particular results, to get to do a particular thing that they wanted to do afterwards. And now you're at that stage afterwards, later on, you got those results, and you're just kind of thinking, oh, what they wanted was just kind of nonsense, it's rubbish. I want to do something else now. Do you somehow have some moral obligation back to them to do what they wanted? Because they were these other entities, these other selves that seemed to make a sacrifice on your behalf. And one other thing to mention is that there's this strange difference between how we treat other selves that are part of ourself and other individuals who are, like me, how I treat you, who are kind of other persons entirely. It's acceptable for me to inflict pain on some future self of mine in order that some further future self doesn't have any pain. This is what we do basically every time we go to the dentist and get a root canal. You're inflicting pain on some future self in order that some further future self doesn't get that. But that would be a hideous thing for me to do if it were other people rather than other selves involved. If I were to inflict a lot of pain on you, in order to kind of avoid pain for some other person. That's not a thing that we think is acceptable. But we do seem to think it's acceptable with selves. Okay, so that's just to kind of highlight there's this kind of deep problem in how people think about decision making because of how values change across time. And one potential solution to it raises these sorts of problems. Okay, thanks very much. I think Christina said to stop share.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Maybe leave that.
We're just trying to see. Yes, here we go.
Yes, so
thank
you
you.
have it.
Perfect. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this around so that I'm not the one that's being seen, but that you are, which would be very nice for Hamburg and for Nick. Okay. Let's hope that works. Darn. Okay. Good. So, yeah, there we go. So, questions. I promised Anne, so we've got a question from Anne for Nick. Nick, are you there? Yep, there he is. Great. Wait, but hold on. We have to use the mic. We have to bring the mic because otherwise they can't hear us in Hamburg. So the mic is very important.
Hi. Yes, question for both Nick and Jan. It was very interesting to hear about OCD and also in subsequent discussion about addiction and decision making. I was wondering, well, first of all, whether there have been any, and to what extent, neural studies of people who have decision-making problems of a different sort, which make them make possibly reckless decisions like pathological gamblers or speeding drivers, and in that context, people who might vary from one to the other, so that, for example, people who might be normally cautious, but every Saturday night they get drunk and then they become reckless in their decision making. And I was wondering, first of all, if there have been any neural studies of brain differences that characterize more reckless decision makers or the same person when they are more reckless, and also whether there have been psychological tests which might differentiate the, such people.
Which of you would like to take it first?
Do you want to start, Jan?
Please, if you would like, please
you go ahead, Nick, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I don't. Well, I think the it's actually quite a hard question from a psychological point of view, actually. I mean, certainly in my world of these sort of particular kinds of models based on sampling, then a really crucial issue is how many samples you draw, and how much you moderate the conclusions that you're going to draw using those samples. So going back to the umbrella case, say, if you're a reckless disposition, you might think, is it going to rain? And just if you look out the window and you think, well, 70%. But actually, on this occasion, I think, no, it isn't going to rain. So you just don't take an umbrella. Now, that's a sort of silly thing to do, particularly if you really hate getting wet. But if you're somebody who has a tendency to be restricted to that very simple sampling strategy and not actively correct for it, and of course, we can always use additional reasoning to correct for our instinctive responses, then you're going to fall into that trap, even if you really, really hate getting wet, because you're simply thinking, I don't have to worry about that, because in this situation, I'm not going to get wet. So reckless gambling, I think, is a bit like this, or it can be. So people think, is this horse going to win? Absolutely, it's going to win. I know in this particular case, it's definitely going to win. So because it's definitely going to win, I don't have to worry about the 20% chance it won't win, because it is going to win. So I'm sort of creating a kind of false sense of a certain world by drawing a single sample, or perhaps a small number, but let's say a single sample of a complex reality, and then just reacting to that. So if I think the horse is going to win, I can bet my house on it. Of course, that is a reckless thing to do. So I suppose perhaps a simple-minded thing to say is to say that if you use these very simple sampling strategies and you don't moderate them, you're going to look pretty reckless a lot of the time. And I think a lot of the time when we're acting quickly and we haven't got much time, then we do that. But of course, hopefully we do reflect and moderate these slightly crazy tendencies that seem quite wired into us.
Thank you.
Jan, do you want to add anything? So, Hamburg, do you have a question?
Not at the moment, thank you.
Do we have one here? Okay, Hadi, could you?
Thank you for the talks. My question is kind of for Richard, but I feel like everyone can chime in. And it's about, I guess, the Aneri example of which seemed to kind of assume, so for example, she, initially wants to become a conservation officer, and then if she decides to become a police officer, due to socialization, it might change her views of what she wants, so she might be someone more conformist, etc. But it doesn't seem to take into account the kind of unpredictability and also bidirectionality of how that socialization can change what those wants and values. So for example, if she now becomes a police officer, what if this dissuades her even more from wanting to be kind of conformist or be in a role that is conformist? So I guess my questions are, does the kind of transformative experience theory / model take into account the unpredictability and also bidirectionality of socialization? And if it does, what kind of factors do you think are important in deciding or predicting, is this change in value going to be, I guess, a positive one or a negative one? Is it going to make someone want to do that or have those values more, or is it going to dissuade them and actually reinforce those initial values? I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Yeah. So I think of course you're absolutely right that there's so I mentioned this study by Matt Barty that potentially. Well, I mean, actually, as I mentioned, it is actually on the career cases a little bit ambiguous. The evidence. What seems to actually one case is actually quite clear: moving to a different country. That it turns out people well, it has to be a different country where the values, the kind of sort of general cultural values are quite different from the country that you moved from. But in all of these cases, Barton and Griffith are reporting kind of an average effect. So you're absolutely right, of course, that also allows that there can be real outliers where the person doesn't socialise their values at all. And actually, as you said, sometimes they can have exactly the opposite effect. The person can kind of really, people actually, that's a reasonably common phenomenon of expats sometimes kind of retrenching to even more kind of allegiance to their home country's values and so on. So yes, so that sort of thing. And so the standard models, yeah, they can build in sort of uncertainty. So you can be uncertain about what sort of individual you'll become. The sort of evidence you can get from that, if you're lucky enough to be doing one of the things that's actually studied in one of these longitudinal studies, like moving to another country, choosing a particular sort of career, choosing a particular degree, which are the ones that Barty studies, then you've got some great kind of good quality empirical evidence. If you aren't lucky enough with that, you're kind of at the mercy of, just asking other people who've done it, and then it can be kind of, vulnerable to all sorts of statistical problems to do with, selection biases and so on. But Barty does actually talk a bit about what she thinks is the source of this. So the difference between the cases, so she's going to talk about choosing which subject you study at university, choosing your career, and choosing the country you live in. She thinks that the biggest effect is, well, she knows that the results are that the biggest effects in moving country, and the explanation that she gives of that is that in that case you're most surrounded by people with these values. In police training, you are, of course, during the workday, surrounded by people with these new values which weren't your own. But, you go home at night, you still kind of often retain the same friendship group you had before. So the old kind of influences are still there. And so what happens when the big difference with moving to a different country seems to be that, it's kind of, she has a term for it that I'm forgetting, but it's kind of all enveloping. That's the idea, kind of everything around you is like that. So that would be some, if she's right about that being the kind of distinguishing factor, that would be something that you could use to kind of help you make those sorts of things. But you're absolutely right. I mean, one thing actually that Laurie Paul is particularly worried about is using this sort of statistical evidence, because she sort of says, well, look at statistical evidence. It just sort of tells you average distribution in the population. It doesn't really tell you anything about you. You might be someone actually who, if you knew more about yourself, might be one of the ones who's really disposed to, the effect you were talking about of responding in the opposite direction to it. And so just learning that lots of other people don't do that is not. So I think there's an interesting question here about what kind of general population level evidence can actually tell you about what things are going to be like for you. My view is that it is helpful and you should take it into account, but there are definitely people like Paul who kind of push back against that. Yeah. That's a great question.
Thank you. Can I just add in something here, which is just a question for you, Richard, on this exact theme, which is, you were talking about this very interesting idea of sort of a group decision among your multiple selves. And presumably the tricky thing to deal with there is the fact that it seems that there are different selves you could become. So I could become the police officer self, or I could become the environmentalist self. But if I become the police officer self, then there isn't an environmentalist future self to have even in the discussion. They're not even in the sort of the mix, are they really? Whereas if I become the environmentalist, it seems like then I have to discuss with my future environmentalist how do they feel about it. And the trouble is, and this is where I think I'm interested in how you're thinking of handling this, that whichever future self I imagine, I think, well, if I were to have a discussion with them about how life went, they'd say, yeah, you did the right thing. Becoming a police officer was great. I value being a police officer. I love it. And similarly, if you become an environmentalist, they've said the same thing too. They both said, yes, great, you made the right choice. But I somehow have to get these two future selves, neither of whom who are mutually incompatible, do I have to get them to discuss with each other, or is there some other strategy that you have in mind?
Yeah, so the way, I mean, yeah, to say how kind of I do it when I'm spelling it out myself. So, you know, this is, I know you know this, Nick, but, you know, and just so that everyone's up to speed, in these standard kind of approaches to decision making that I was mentioning, this kind of expected utility approaches, where then what you do is you kind of have a bunch of different sort of ways the world could turn out, kind of, you know, future histories of the world, sort of the way the world might evolve. And for each of them, you assign to them kind of how much you would value that it going that way, you know, kind of give a number to how good would it be for my point of view if it went that way. So the way you can do it in this model is just for each of those kind of future trajectories of the world, it's fixed, you know, what future selves I will be in it. So there's one future trajectory of the world where I become the police officer, and I kind of, you know, I look at, and, you know, and so in order to fix the value that I'm going to assign for that then I discuss between me now and that future self that's going to be there in that world, and I kind of, you know, amalgamate our values in some way and give that value to the whole thing, and then I do the same thing for the future. So you'd never get ones where two cross worlds, two incompatible future selves would be.
And is there a tricky thing though? This is what I'm interested in, I suppose, in terms of how we deal with the possible clash between the future selves. If I imagine there's one future self in which I turn into a monstrous narcissist, but a very happy one, I might think, well, if I just work out all the trajectories and how happy I'll be in each of them, I might think, well, yeah, the monstrous narcissist trajectory is looking pretty good. But on the other hand, from where I sit now, I might think, oh, but that's just, I just don't want to be there. That just sounds dreadful. I'm going back to the suggestion that you mentioned and said wasn't quite satisfactory earlier. I might have a great sense of horror, but maybe on this future trajectory account, maybe I should just bite the bullet and think, you know, like, it seems pretty horrible now, but I won't regret it. Once I'm a monstrous narcissist, I'll be delighted. I mean, is that a problem, or? So the way,
yes, sorry. And actually, presumably that's not what the camera is anyway, so I'm not sure why I'm addressing it. So the way that I kind of, yeah, in this version of the account, the way that I deal with that is that the sort of group decision that we're talking about is actually of a rather unusual sort. Most group decisions we have, like voting for an elected official or something, everyone is sort of equally, you know, has equal say in the vote. Well, yeah, in an ideal democratic situation. In this sort of situation I'm talking about, there's a particular person who has a sort of privileged position in the decision, namely the current self, the self who's kind of there making the decision. So really what this is, the better analogy than kind of a country voting for a particular, you know, say in a referendum, the better thing to think of is something like, actually quite a good example, analogy is an academic department. So at least in the UK, academic departments work like this, that there's a head of department, a kind of chair of department, who might make decisions on behalf of the department. But that role circulates. I mean, sometimes that's kind of to some extent gone now, but often the model was everyone kind of does it for 3 years, then hands on to the next person. Everyone knows that's going to be the situation. You don't get elected to it, you don't kind of interview, if you just, it's your time to do it. And that's a similar sort of case, that's by analogy, the sort of analogy I was thinking of with this, this sort of model. So, you know, there's this set of selves that, you know, is your past and future selves and your current self. And basically, you know, at each point, there's a decision maker who's kind of like the head of department at that particular time. But they know it's going to move on to someone else at a later time. But you're tasked with making a decision on behalf of that group. But you can give, to some extent, you can give some privilege to your position as the, you know, as kind of the head of department, sort of, you know, prerogative to guide things in the way that they think is sort of, to some extent, right. But they also have to take into account the variety of views around the department. Similarly, the current self has to take into account, you know, the other selves that are going to exist, but they can give some kind of extra weight. And so in the narcissist case, where I'm looking forward to a kind of future where there's a sort of narcissist, it could be, and so there's going to be different considerations that will determine these weights in different situations. And one of those considerations may be if I currently kind of morally abhor the person that I'm going to become. I mean, I'm not sure, Nick, whether you were thinking that the narcissist was literally morally abhorrent or just not the sort of person I much want to be. But
I did question actually. Even better. Your moral abhorrence case would be even better, I think.
Yeah. So that sort of case, would be that in that case, just as the head of department kind of is perfectly legitimate for them to discount the views of one member of the department that they think have kind of morally abhorrent views. They similarly could discount this narcissist's future self, or the morally abhorrent future self. So I think there's lots of questions about how you get to make these, how you get to kind of weight the different selves in the future when you're making these decisions. And this is something, in fact, this philosopher that I was talking about, Derek Parfit, was interested in. He had a much more simplistic, well, no, not simplistic, but he had a very, in some way, straightforward view. The only thing that determines the weights that you give to these other selves is the extent to which you're kind of psychologically connected to them, the extent to which their kind of psychological states overlap with or are continuous with the ones that you have. But I think there's much more to it than that. There's also questions about, to what extent do you think that person's a kind of morally okay person? Do you kind of recognize yourself in them? Those sorts of considerations. But yes, but it's that same sort of view that there's these weights that you can give to them.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead, Micah.
Does that mean that decision-making becomes easier as you age because there are few future selves to consider?
Yeah, good question. It's an interesting question. Actually, it's funny that when I've talked about this in the past, I've actually had the exact kind of inverse questions. Or does this make decision-making terribly difficult for children? But I think, in some sense, yes. But one feature of this account, which I think is really nice, but goes against what a lot of people have thought about it, is that it does become possible that you should give weight to past selves. So a standard thing that was kind of thought for a long time, really, it was almost kind of taken for granted that past selves should just, should have absolutely no, the kind of, it was a bit like the dead hand of the past sort of objection to conservatism, that there was a sort of feeling that, yeah, you should not, the past values that you had just don't have any effect on you once you've changed to having other values. But on this account, they may well do. They may well have some effect. And indeed, you might have some obligation to take them into account because of, say, sacrifices that they made for you. So if, as an older person, maybe as a retired person where your younger selves had made kind of enormous sacrifices in order to kind of provide you with a kind of comfortable quality of life in older age, then you might think that you have some obligation to see through projects that they thought of as valuable. If they had kind of, I'm not sure what sort of projects you might have in mind, but perhaps it's kind of care for a friend or something like that who you've since come to kind of not particularly like. You might think you have some obligation to the past self who really valued that friendship to kind of see that through. So actually, I think in some sense you're probably right. These obligations to past selves are reasonably uncommon, I think. They require quite a lot of kind of sacrifice to make them kick in, but it could be that these old people, kind of later on in life, do have some of those to consider. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there's time for one more question. So let me see who there is, and I think there is just one question. So let's have that, and let's try and make it brief, and then we can stop on time because I know Nick has to go.
All right. Hi. Do we say our name? Okay, we don't. Oh, do we? Okay, anyway, I'm Crystal. Hi. Thank you for your talk. It was pretty great. So just on the thought of kind of suggesting that we think of all ourselves as like a group. And then you also suggested just now whether we should maybe consider having like obligations perhaps to our past selves. And I think my intuition is that we shouldn't. And you were talking about like, oh, maybe they make these like great sacrifices. We should, because they make such big sacrifices for us to have like certain things now, we should then consider them as you would probably commonly in a group. But I guess my thought is just like, why would we do that? We don't even care about their like what they care about before, but like presumably now what matters is my current self and all our future selves. And so I was thinking maybe the idea is that we still consider a group, but just the present self along with all our future selves. Which is, I guess, why someone suggested perhaps it's a bit easier for like an older person because they have less future selves. But then presumably I was thinking there's this common practice. Well, I seem to do it to myself. I wonder if other people do it to themselves or to their friends. I seem to ask myself, hey, Crystal, in 20 years, like, what would you care about? And kind of like model what you're doing now based on what your future, say, self in 20 years would care about. And like sometimes ask my friends, like, you know, picture yourself in 20 years. And it seems that by making that move or like asking myself that question and presumably carrying on with, you know, following that means I value my future self from 20 years ago more than I do now, which is kind of why we said, oh, it seems permissible or like even good or rational for someone to allow themselves to have some like near-term, like short-term suffering for a long-term benefit or whatever. And then I'm like, well, then maybe we can do that again to yourself in 20 years and be like, hey, consider yourself another 20 years. And I wonder whether this approach then leads to an extent where we only consider our interests on our deathbed or something, our last self, and whether that would be like a very irrational thing to do. And so like, if that is the case, like almost where in the steps have we gone wrong, if that makes sense. Sorry, it's like a huge thing.
No, that's great. So just the very first thing, just so to make you a little bit more sympathetic to the past self thing. I mean, the way I introduced in something I wrote was that we do seem to think something like this about, say, other people who have made sacrifices for us, even if they are, their own preferences are past. So perhaps if the person who's made sacrifices for us has died, for instance. So, you know, imagine a case of someone whose grandparent makes a lot of sacrifices in order to kind of, again, maybe I'm thinking of the education example. It's not the only sort of example you could think of, but, you know, maybe they've made a lot of sacrifices to ensure that the person, that your grandparent has made a huge amount of sacrifices to ensure that you can kind of, you know, get a certain amount, you know, of education and kind of preparation towards the things that you want to do, and then they die, and then later on you're kind of against doing the sort of things. I don't think in any way this should be a decisive consideration. Otherwise, people can essentially kind of impose a sort of emotional blackmail on you by making sacrifices for you. But it should at least be a consideration. So when I say that you should pay attention to past selves, I'm not necessarily saying they should like get decisive weight or overwhelming weight or something, but that you should give at least some consideration to them. They should be a potential, say, a tiebreaker or something like that.
I think, no, we have to stop, I'm afraid. As you can see, we've already lost Professor Chatter. He had I think he's doing interviews in Warwick, so he had to get back to the interview process. So I think I'm going to wind it up because it is 7:15, 7:20 actually. Thank you so much. I hope you could see tonight the very different approaches of the three subjects, because when we get to the philosophy, I think you really do get a slightly different perspective. You even get a different language almost. And I think some people value the more scientific language and some value the more kind of everyday language that makes something a little bit more accessible. But I hope everybody found something tonight, and I'd like to thank our speakers, and in absentia, Nick. Goodbye to Hamburg. We'll see you in Trinity term.
Yes, goodbye. Everything will be from Hamburg then, so we're looking forward to welcoming you.
Okay, enjoy your dinner and see you. Bye-bye. Thank you all.